Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and Michelle's co-host here at the club. We hope you are staying safe and are well wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you in person again someday in the future at the Commonwealth Club's headquarters in San Francisco. Until that happens, we are doing all of our programming online. In fact, the latest in more than 275 online programs the club has produced in the past 6 months. You can find all of our upcoming programs, as well as audio and video from our past events and how you can help support our program production at commonwealthclub.org. If you're watching us live on YouTube or Facebook, you can use the chat function to post questions for our panelists, and we'll work them into our conversation here today. Now, let me introduce Michelle Meow, a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors and the producer and host of The Michelle Meow Show. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club for providing space for these important conversations. A survey has just been released by the Asian American Advancing Justice, Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, and AAPI data that showed that 54% of Asian American voters will vote for presidential candidate Joe Biden compared to 30% for President Trump. However, Vietnamese Americans are the only Asian American group that prefer President Trump at 48%, compared to 36% for Joe Biden. 14% of Vietnamese Americans are still undecided. And so we'll have a discussion today. Why the big, huge support for President Trump? Our panel today includes Vietnamese American voters who are active contributors to their communities and society by politics, civics, advocacy, and education. Let's welcome Dr. Thao Ha, who is a professor at Miracosta College, advisor and associate producer for Seadrift, a member of the board of directors for Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association, also for the Oceanside Promise, and an advisory board member for Asian Culture and Media Alliance. We have Juicy Liu, who's a drag queen, winner of GAPA Runway pageant in 2016, the host of JuicyThoughts.com podcasts, and activist, the social chair, membership co-chair, and communications co-chair for Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom, and also Bao-Ki Vu, who's the principal at Silverberry Capital, former policy advisor for State Representative BJ Pak, Governor's 4th Congressional District Board member for Technical College System of Georgia, vice chair of DeKalb County Board of Voter Registration and Elections, and also treasurer of DeKalb County Development Authority. Welcome all. Thanks for joining us for this very important discussion.
For having me on.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Michelle. You're awesome.
Yeah.
Hi.
Well, I always think, a good way to kick off an important conversation is to get to know all of our panelists better on a personal level. And being, Southeast Asian myself, part Vietnamese, I always like to tell, the story of my family's migration. And so if you will, please, each of you, we'll start with Bao-Ki, begin with your own family immigration story, and even share with us quickly being politically, the moment you've become politically aware, deciding on a political party, the values, what were important to you, what was shared to you, and your family. So Bao-Ki.
All right, well, I'll take it away first then. So my family has actually been out of Vietnam for many years. In 75, we left before the fall of Saigon because, and by U.S. State Department plane, my father's brother-in-law was actually a U.S. State Department official. And now on my mother's side, we also have had relatives who either worked for the South Vietnamese embassy here in the States prior to that, or in some other diplomatic roles. So we left, we came over here through the camps, and I always tell people of the trips through the Subic Bay, and then Camp Anderson in Guam, and then on to Camp Pendleton, which is near where Dr. Thao Ha resides nowadays. We visited some family here before we immigrated over to Australia. My father had gone to school there in the 60s, so we came to Australia with a good support network. I loved Australia. We lived in Sydney, and for a family of 3 boys, we actually had a lot of fun growing up. Came back here really because of a family health issue with my maternal grandmother. So we've been back here for 42 years. Yeah, so, living in parts of DC and then also Texas, but having resided in Atlanta off and on for the last 40 years. Yeah, glad to join you all.
Dr. Ha.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I left in 1975 on April 30th, the fall of Saigon. So a little bit after you, Valky. My dad was a pilot in the South Vietnamese Air Force, and he flew C-130 Hercules cargo planes. So we left on one of those. We were in a refugee camp in Guam, and we landed in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. We were sponsored by a family in San Antonio, Texas. And from there, we moved around the country to Knoxville, Tennessee, then Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then eventually settled in 1978 in Houston. And I grew up in Texas and lived there until 2004 when I left for my first job in teaching. And then made my way to Oceanside, California in 2007. So my heart is somewhat still in Texas, although my political awakening was, I don't know if there was a moment, but I grew up in a very religious family. We were Baptists growing up. And so I felt very suffocated by a lot of the restrictions. And so I was taking a world religion class, and that kind of just like, whoo. And so I think I've been very progressive ever since. And I love that we're on this program talking about Vietnamese Trump supporters because my parents are. And so as a personal endeavor through family relations. So I'm looking forward to this very much. Thank you.
And Juicy.
Hey, so yeah, my parents actually met at Ecklings Air Force Base in Florida. So my mom actually escaped off of the top of the embassy building. She was working for the State Department as a lawyer and kind of aid worker. And then my dad actually was a helicopter pilot in the South Vietnamese Air Force. So I bet my dad probably knows, they know each other because they all know each other. They had social networking before there was social networking on the web. It was called the phone. So my dad and my mom met actually at refugee camp at Ecklings Air Force Base. My mom actually went to Chicago first, settled with the Jewish Family Services because they basically would give you money for a apartment and then just kind of like, bye, good luck, And then my dad actually was sponsored in Florida, but then he eventually made his way to Chicago, and then I was born in Chicago area, moved around my whole life. I'm the only child. Ended up in Texas also, in Plano, north of Dallas. But I did live in Georgia at one point in Gwinnett County, in Lawrenceville. So I've been all around. I lived in New Orleans. Now I'm here in San Francisco. I feel like my political awakening came in actually right after it was 2000. It was the Bush v. Gore decision, and it was I was 18, my first time voting. And then I was like, what is happening? And then there was the Dean for Texas campaign. I jumped on that. But I didn't really awaken until actually Obama in 2008 I had just graduated law school. I was working on a big firm job. I was like, I'm going to make a big contribution because I can. And I was pushing for Obama's election, which was amazing. But also I was here in California, and it was the same as no on Prop 8. Prop 8 won. That was kind of a bittersweet moment. I really feel like my political awakening has always been tied with my queerness, and being queer and Vietnamese. Growing up wasn't there were no role models, and so the two had always been tied. And part of the reason why I went to law school, and then I just sort of kept going as an activist from there. So I'm so excited for this conversation. As I'm also the chair of GAPA, the Gay Asian Pacific Alliance, here in the Bay Area, and this kind of conversation is much needed, especially for our queer trans Vietnamese people who are probably living at home with Vietnamese Trumpers. So.
Well, Dr. Ha, you mentioned that your political views differ from your parents. So kind of that question for Beoki and Juicy. Are your views in line with what your parents were? Are they different? Have they shifted over time? I mean, is there any difference there generationally?
So, actually, I first became involved with the college Republicans in the late 80s, early 90s. And back then, first of all, the Republican Party was, especially on college campuses, it was slowly gravitating from being fairly democratic over to the Republican side. It's based on ideas, free trade. It was based on Ronald Reagan's ideas of free trade, pro-immigration, right? And talking about the globalization that's taking place in the world. So that was the natural gravitation back in the early 90s. And that's how I was able to work on a couple of these campaigns, which crescended in, me being nominated by George W. Bush to be on a presidential commission in his first term. But then I started seeing the type of Tea Party sentiments, anti-business, anti-education, anti-science. And then I guess in the late decade of the 2010, there was some dissonance already in how I was feeling. I mean, I've got two younger brothers, and one was a former naval officer. He became involved actually in teaching over the San Francisco Unified District, right? And then later on moved up to Seattle to work for the Gates Foundation. He's like, wait, this Republican Party, it doesn't make sense, So that's when I noticed that instinctively, I too wasn't going to, wasn't feeling great vibes with it anymore. Yeah. So, and I think obviously 2016, that did it. I mean, it was a complete, it was certainly a break from Donald Trump, because I was actually on the Electoral College in 2016. And I was nominated to be on the Electoral College by the folks within the Georgia GOP at a point in time when Donald Trump had not, taken the lead. So my support was for Governor Bush, Jeb first, and then Marco Rubio. And lo and behold, I wasn't going to stand for Donald Trump. So that's when I just said, forget it. Yeah.
Which reminds me of the Peter Sagal joke that the Electoral College is the worst school since Trump University. Juicy, how do your politics differ, or are they the same as your parents? Or did you kind of get it from them, or did your political awakening, was that your own?
Yeah, actually, growing up, my parents never really talked about politics. All they really talked about was education, study hard, do well in school. This is how you will succeed in America. Success is very important. And then, help the family, make the family proud. But I would say I first started talking to my parents about politics, after law school. And I didn't know my dad is a Republican and my mom is a Democrat. And so they're split. And so, and they're divorced now. So, that's something. But, I tried to talk to my dad. Actually, in preparation for this meeting, I was trying to talk with my dad about it, but he doesn't like to talk about politics too much. It's weird. It's this whole, I am the father. I know what I'm doing. I know better. And my uncle is like this. So my mom's brother is, a much older brother, right? He's a definitely Trump supporter. He's in Southern California. So whenever I read Orange County Trump supporters, I think of my uncle Gauchin, and he is just, I don't know what it is about it, but he's so far into Trump land, and he's so excited about Trumpers. And I just sort of like, and also he sees me in drag. He knows that I'm a drag queen. He knows that I'm an activist. He knows that I'm out there on the streets, like organizing and stuff like this. So it's kind of this weird, but I talk to my mom all the time, and it's just, my mom thinks, it's just talk about the Vietnamese refugees' allegiance to the Republicans for decades now. And so it's just sort of this, I talked to my mom about it. It's like, I think they need to understand in Vietnamese that, for me, at least, my understanding of the GOP is not right now, they're not in the best interest of the Vietnamese American community.
So that's a good segue to a question. We'll begin with you, Dr. Ha. I mean, Bauke did a very brief overview of why the Republican Party then might have been enticing or at least, of interest for first generation Vietnamese Americans or immigrants, to be a part of. Why are your parents supporting, President Trump? Some of the issues that Bauke had brought up, the then Republican Party were pro-immigration, free trade. I mean, I could see a little bit of some policies or issues that, President Trump, that might be a good thing for Vietnamese American voters, first generation, but immigration? And let's start even just talking about that. It's a huge difference. Why do you think your parents are pro President Trump?
Well, number one, China as an issue. So it's the number one reason to state why they support Trump. And, Vietnam as a country itself, there are Trump supporters in Vietnam, and they have social network groups and pictures and a fervor. The myths about, or the narratives about Trump being tough on China, being a businessman, so he knows how to do trade policy, so the fear of socialism, which is attached to Democrats, Marxism attached to Black Lives Matter, these narratives that have been created and are widely perpetuated on these media, YouTube channels, newspapers. So kind of fomenting like fear, a very real fear. And I think it draws back to the Vietnam War itself as a trauma, a legacy of trauma for our first generation family members and community. And so you'll hear also comments about, well, you don't know communism. We lived through it and it's awful. It's all Ho Chi Minh is, XYZ. And comparing him to Hitler. I've heard all of that. And it's not just, my parents, it's very common to hear the sentiment. And recently in a conversation with my parents, we talked about the generational gap because they were sharing with me, well, so-and-so's kids are against them too. And so-and-so and so-and-so. And they started to list all these aunties and uncles who have kids my age and are rejecting their parents' political affiliation. This one young woman, she's 19. Oh no, she just turned 21. I remember getting to know her when she was 19, and she recently told me that her grandparents, who are in their 70s, Vietnamese Americans, asked her to help them register to vote, and she said, "Well, it depends on who you're voting for." And they said they were voting for Trump. And she said, "Well, I'm not going to help you then." So, I think I touched on some of those broader themes that are reasons why we have that gap.
Balki, I think you're the natural person to go next to kind of, answer.
Thanks for highlighting my age.
No. What I meant from that was just because, first of all, there's a great opinions piece that you wrote, and I think is that on CNN or?
Yeah. So I tell you, CNN, it's great. Thank you for alluding to that. That was a piece they wanted me to contribute to because I had tried to write this from a political operative's perspective. And so there was a piece I wrote earlier where I emphasized two things. One was, I think, to use the proverbial term, fighting the last war. I thought it encapsulated what the older generations are going through, right? They lost the war. They had to find someone to scapegoat, okay? And then the other thing was, and I have a professional mentor who used to say this to me, he says, the wish is the father of the thought. You wish something and you'll find everything in order to back up that story, right? So what Thao had mentioned is basically China, and then also the perception that the Democratic Party had betrayed the South Vietnamese government in the 70s by, and who can blame America in the 70s? You had high inflation, you had high oil prices. Where do you spend your money? Do you spend it on internal issues or do you spend it on a war, 10,000 miles away, right? So those are the two issues that I think have not been able to, the seniors have not been able to get over that. And today they still fight the last war because why? I mean, my parents, look, my father was educated in Australia. and yet they fall into this trap of reading the same news cycles that Tao and Juicy have noticed. And it's hilarious because some of these things you wonder, where do they get it from? And I think that now I will say that there is hope because like recently when I've been going on air and actually confronting some of them about it by raising up, Donald Trump accusing Barack Obama of, of a fake birth certificate, right? And a doctored Kenyan birth certificate of all places, right? These are the things you have to call them out on. And if you don't call them out, they all, they get into this frame where they think they could bully you. Well, heck, you know what? It's time to fight back, right? Yeah.
Do you see anything to add to that? And kind of, we just softballed it, but thoughts and opinions on why the support for President Trump when, I mean, personally, I don't feel that he's representational of the Republican Party that Bauke had described, way back when. I think that it's a very extreme difference. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what it is that Trump is really good at is instilling fear into people and then saying, I am the solution. I can solve all your problems, and be very simplistic about it. And I am strong on China. He always says this. Like Trump always says this. When in fact it's like Trump, has all these tariffs that impose, consumers. We're paying the taxes, but it's just Democrats have a issue about like communicating a message like that's as simple as I am strong on China and vote for me, I will solve all your problems. And I think like a lot of Vietnamese Americans fall into the trap of just thinking, okay, we hate China. Sorry, there's this long-standing thing about China. We don't like China, and so he's strong on China. And okay, great. And he's like he hates communism. Maybe, I don't know. Because just China. He keeps saying China. And communism is very strongly tied to China. And so there's just that natural ease of sort of I don't have to think about it. And then the Democrats, the other thing is my mom, I remember she said, I'll never forgive Jane Fonda because she was with the communists in the Viet Cong. I mean, she talked about, this is like 40 something years ago, and Jane Fonda is a super liberal, and so the Democrats are all communists. Like that's basically the message that they hear. And so like, how dare you, I hear this, I talk to, I do a lot of phone banking. I talk to Vietnamese Americans in Pennsylvania. A whole bunch of them are undecided. If you want to try to make a difference, Pennsylvania, Democrats, they're doing a lot of phone banking, but Viet's for Biden. But yeah, it's ridiculous how many like young people are kind of like, all my parents, are thinking about Trump, voting for Trump and yelling, and they're screaming at each other, and it's like, I hear the stories, it's like, oh, how dare my daughter, how dare my son vote for a Democrat? That means the communists, it's this very simplistic thinking, and it's not very sophisticated, like policy-based arguments as far as like why I'm a Democrat, versus a Republican. And I think that's a big part of our community. And then it's just people talking to each other, and then they just listen to whoever's speaking in Vietnamese, and as if it's truth. They don't bother to like look at the facts.
And and Donald Trump, you're right, Juicy, because Donald Trump, he's tried to frame this as a struggle between communism, socialism versus capitalism. And I'm trying to explain to these folks it's actually about democracy versus the autocracy, right? Has nothing, because socialism, communism, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they're not fighting to own businesses. They don't want governments to take over the businesses. In fact, it's only, so I would phrase, and this is where I think we need to fight back and say, all we're asking for is a more compassionate form of capitalism, right? Because we can see where it can be fixed. It's just like Obamacare. It can be improved. We're not talking about overthrowing the system right here, but the Viets are crazy because it gets into that loop of, oh my gosh, here we go, it's communism again. Half of these folks don't even know what socialism is when you explain it to them, right?
One of our viewers writes, my mother, who is a Democrat, who voted for Hillary and hated Trump for many years, is now voting for him because of his toughness on China. Well, this is kind of, you've touched on this in one way or another, and that is the media that Vietnamese Americans are consuming. If they're conservative, maybe they're going for the usual Fox or for other things. But are there Vietnamese specific media that are being consumed, whether it's print or online, And what sort of political affiliations do those have, or what sort of ideological bent do you see in those? Anyone who can answer that?
Let me start by just saying that I think with the internet is merely another medium of communication, right? So nowadays you have all sorts of stuff, whether it's on the right or the left. What I have received, and this is over really about 20 years of having been involved in the communities, is the fact that you have these manufactured, you have certain personalities now that take their news from a certain place and manufacture it based on what they see from Newsmax or from Breitbart. And then they inflame it even further. And then it gets distributed widely through YouTube. And then at home, you've got these seniors sitting around, and they're not gonna watch a Fox. Sometimes they don't even watch a Fox. What they'll do is they want to watch something that they can understand in Vietnamese, right? And so it's easy to gravitate towards something that's sensationalized. I mean, who would have thought that, I've got an 85-year-old father who's an electrical engineer by training, who actually, has written books, and suddenly he's falling into this trap. And the funny story is this: they will also not be aware that even the sales job, the con jobs they get from stories about how the society is going to collapse and they need to hoard gold. So my father, 3 years ago, while he was on a vacation with my mother and my siblings down to South America, I found out from him that, or not from him, but I was taking calls while they were away. He had decided to go out and buy a bunch of gold, physical gold, and he's got to figure out where to store this. That's the type of mentality you have now. Again, we're talking about somebody who actually was educated over here, buying into these loopy stories, right? And so my generation, my cousins, my siblings, they're wondering, and we make fun of it because we'll say, well, okay. My mother called me yesterday and said, somehow the TV volume's not working anymore. And I texted my brothers, and one of the brothers said, hey, you know what? Maybe they've had Fox News on so loudly, it went out. So the other one said, well, let's not try to fix it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to add to that because I'm part of Pivot, which is the progressive organization for Vietnamese organization, and they created a Vietnamese fact check online because there's such a problem of misinformation on Vietnamese, Vietnamese language on YouTube. Just to add to that, there's basically the equivalent of Alex Jones in Vietnamese spewing InfoWars type craziness, and people in the Vietnamese community, they just take it as truth because hey, it's on YouTube, so it must be true. Basically, because it looks nice, the guy speaking is handsome and speaking really good Vietnamese. Basically, that's the measure. There's no other measure. And so Pivot, I'm really proud of the work at Pivot, and I know a lot of folks who are founders, and Dr. Tung Nguyen, and here in San Francisco, Viet Thanh Nguyen's brother is the president, and it's an organization, but I feel like we're behind the game already. We're losing because the progressives are just sort of we're trying to react and we're trying to raise money, but it's there's this whole other machine that's been going on for decades, and it's very hard to combat.
By the way, hey, Thao, is Vela, the Letters and Arts, isn't that affiliated with Isa Lê and Hạo Nhiên Vũ?
Yes.
Okay, so Hạo Nhiên is actually a second cousin of mine.
Oh, okay. Wow, we're all interconnected.
I'm sure we're all, including you, John. Dr. Ha, did you have anything to add to that before we go to the next question?
No, that's very thorough, but just also how algorithms work, so once you into a network, it feeds you all of the common threads of the similar types of stories. And so it's a feedback loop, an echo chamber. And they'll see another version of the video and it kind of confirms the bias even more. So it's that Kruger-Dunning effect where you don't know what you don't know. You think you know, but you don't really know. And so it's a psychological place for folks it's a very difficult place to break someone's views because it's now deeply rooted as confirmed for them. Yeah.
As John mentioned earlier, a comment from our audience, please do send us questions or comments and we'll try to get them to our panel. Uh, I wanted to go back to, I brought up immigration, and it's hard for me, the image of the kids separated and a lot of the folks seeking asylum from Central America, because some of those images are the same images that, the stories that many of the people in Southeast Asian communities have told. And so I'm trying to reconcile and understand how some folks can say, well, we support President Trump because of his immigration policies, knowing that, well, when our first generation had to escape their countries, they've been displaced because of US involvement in the politics. This gets really complex, because especially when you want to talk about the Vietnam War and countless folks who had depended on the United States from, Vietnam regarding that war. The legal path to migrate to the United States has to be created. And if there is no legal path and that person isn't able to migrate and they've become illegal, how do you as a voter now, when you've been given the opportunity to come, and I'm just asking this to see if you've even had these conversations, these hard conversations with your family members, that that's hypocritical. Like, I mean, you're just because you've gotten here, but then you're going to say, well, those people are not, they've come illegally, they shouldn't be here. I'd love to hear from all of you how you've talked about this with folks who might be supportive of the president's immigration policies. Who'd like to go first?
Oh boy. Why don't you guys take it?
Okay, I'll go. One of the common responses is that we came here legally, or we came here the right way. So again, back to fear mongering and back to types of information that get simplified, is that these folks are here, the wrong way. Why don't they come the right way? Why don't they come the legal way? And so to understand what that means politically, policy-wise, structural-wise, that's a very complicated immigration law. And I think you could speak to this, Juicy. It is complicated, and it is absolutely different from the 70s into the 80s when we had when Reagan was president. And he was pro-immigration, as Bao-Ki mentioned, and he was even willing to grant amnesty to the undocumented folks here in America at that time. And so his immigration reform was about granting citizenship to folks here who were undocumented. And so to understand why they were undocumented in the first place, you said the words very well, Michelle. It's like, how do you make some legal or illegal? Right? Inherently, we are all beings. So, the millions who were undocumented became undocumented when the Bracero program ended. Right? So the Bracero program it existed, and they were here legally working. It ended. All of a sudden, boom! Now they're illegal. And so, how do we create this pathway to citizenship for them? And yet, then, even when we had those laws, the politicians who were influenced by business watered it down so that corporations were not, it was not a way to enforce them from hiring undocumented folks. So they continued to employ these individuals. So I'm talking about this very complex system, and our parents and even a lot of us don't understand it well enough. It's not in our wheelhouse. And so the simplified way of explaining it, like Juicy said, is to just paint this picture of fear. They're here illegally. They're taking our jobs. They commit crimes. They're gang members, MS-13 and Colombian drug cartels, and all of that politicized fear mongering is a very real thing. And it also separates, it's a way to dehumanize these individuals as separate from ourselves. And so that we went it was a human rights condition for us. We were trauma, war inflicted, escaping communism, and these people just want to come for jobs.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, and thank you for bringing that, Dr. Ha, because it's so incredibly mind-boggling to me when I hear like, oh, but we had, we were escaping communism, we were fleeing like a war-torn country, and these people just want to like take my jobs or take, raise, take all the services and everything like that. We have to realize that America has a very complicated immigration story, and especially with Asian Americans, and we are now in the 2020 era, but like this has been happening since the Chinese Exclusion Act, when they specifically said no Chinese, like sorry, in the 1800s, no more, and they had all these racist things in San Francisco, like people it's just nuts. I learned so much watching PBS, that Asian American special. Fast forward to the 40s and 50s with the anti-Japanese sentiment and the second generation Japanese Nisei Americans kind of being ported off to the concentration camps. Now we're here. I'm a second generation Vietnamese American, and I think we are now having our moment of like a real reconciliation of what is our immigration story and how are we going to identify ourselves as a community, and what do we stand for? Do we stand for freedom and liberty and justice and all the things that all my father loves, freedom, liberty, justice, but then we don't give that to people who are trying to escape, like Syrian refugees, so like the authoritarian regimes, or all the the people from Central America that are trying to escape all the violence of gangs and everything. No, we don't give it to them. It's just weird for me, but they don't like to. It's this very simplistic argument again that Dr. Taha mentioned. That it's. I think it's now. This is up to us and everybody who's speaking right now, and everybody listening. This is our moment to really like right the ship here.
And at its core, really, when you think about Vietnamese and the broader Asian Americans who have come over from Asia, when you think about the boundaries we have over thousands of years of existence, we too are xenophobic when you think about it, right? I mean, even if you were raised in Vietnam, then you look down upon the the Amerasians, for instance, right? Or you regarded the the Montagnards and so forth as second-class citizens. So I think what Donald Trump speaks to is already a strain of xenophobia that's inherently in the psyche of the Vietnamese, right? I mean, what used to be, I think it's just that level of homogeneity that was already existing in our culture transplanted over here. And so that's where I think, this generation, we've been thrown into this melting pot, and we're able to acclimate ourselves much more quickly than they could.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the acclimation. One thing before John asks his question, going back to this conversation around immigration, over 120,000 Vietnamese refugees came to the United States. And in my opinion, due to the failure of the US government and the politicizing of the Vietnam War, I mean, we went through 5 presidents during the Vietnam War, and the last 3 between President Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, somewhere in between Johnson and Nixon, I find that there was a heavy politicizing of the Vietnam War, and so you can't really say that it was the Democrats' fault or the Republicans' fault, but in the end, America failed Vietnam, and we had to put those immigration policies in place for the 100 and some thousands of folks who had to come, but we also lost, nearly 60,000 lives, American lives, 3 million Vietnamese lives, and countless other people who were trying to escape Vietnam during that time. And so where I'm trying to go with that is that I think that there's a lost narrative. If your parents or your grandparents today feel very strongly against a certain political party, due to the immigration policies or the Vietnam War, I think that there needs to be a whole lot of clarification on what actually happened. And placing blame isn't helping us today when democracy is at risk, right? And so anyway, I just wanted to make that point is that also when we talk about US involvement in other countries and why people migrate here, um, we're getting caught up in these false narratives. And then to make it worse, you have a president who has an anti-immigration administration, very anti, and is placing folks like Tony Pham as a interim ICE director, in which people then now we're pitted even further against each other and saying, we can come up with policies that make good and not good, immigrants of some sort. But I don't want to speak for Tony. I don't know, where he's going to go with his new position. And at the same time, you have a person who can speak strongly about refugee experiences for an administration that is actively deported, Vietnamese people. So here we are.
Tony Pham speaks for himself by accepting that position. That's how he speaks. He's speaking volumes by accepting that position. So I just want to clarify that. And I want to follow up a couple of things. The notion that the U.S. is involved, the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam and all of the other countries and the wars that have come out of American interests. And so that is one view, but the view from Vietnamese refugees is, well, America saved us. They took us in, and there's this refugee debt, right? Identity that we have to be grateful. There's a sense of gratitude for being accepted into this country, for opportunities in this land of plenty. And so then the Make America Great Again or nationalism and patriotism falls in line with that thinking, and that to critique America is to be ungrateful, right? And so that's another gap in the generational understanding of how we even think about Vietnam, America's involvement and America's relationship with us as Vietnamese refugees.
We have a viewer who comments, my parents won't believe that Trump Republicans want to deport them. They say that can never happen here. They don't know about Japanese internment or the Chinese Exclusion Act. Donald Trump is a unique president in many ways. But Belkey, you were kind of talking about how becoming disenchanted with Republican Party even before Trump. So I'll start with you, but the question will be for all of you, which is, do you think that older generation or generations of Vietnamese Americans who have been staunch Republicans, do you think that there is any message that would change their mind, whether it's to support, Republican alternatives to Trump or to vote Democratic? Or do you think this is a lifelong commitment for them now for the rest of their lives? Starting with you, Belkey.
Again, they're fighting the last war and they're not going to change. Two comparisons I would note would be kind of similar to and it's very funny, no, not so funny, but Jim Jones and drinking the Kool-Aid. That would be one example. The other example is that in Taiwan, there was actually a spiritual cult leader, a woman by the name of Thanh Hai. And I remembered even some of the Vietnamese Americans over here who at one time, it's kind of like Reverend Moon of South Korea. And Reverend Moon, in all seriousness, he's actually, I would not consider him along the lines of a cult, the same way that this Taiwanese spiritual leader Thanh Hai was. But the manifestations of Donald Trump basically is the worst strains of the Tea Party elements as it's developed over the last 15 years. And as Tao mentioned, this manifestation is easy for the older Vietnamese Americans to grasp. It's easy when you can crawl back into your shell and just accept the same way that the Christian right accepts these anti-science notions. And so I don't think I don't think they're salvageable, but that doesn't mean we can't fight in order to defend, right? Because to me, if we don't speak up, then we ourselves have failed. So we have to speak up and continue speaking out against it, because to me, you got to be on the right side of history. That's a simple message for me. Yeah.
I think for me, the question is, is an education piece on teaching the older Vietnamese Americans on what it is to be a good American, and to Dr. Ha's point, there is this like big, we have to be grateful to be here, and I'm proud to be an American, and that to be an American means to be Republican in their mind. And this whole patriotism, to me, that's a false narrative. I'm a proud Democrat, and I am proud to be an American, and I am here for dissent. Like, I am here to like fight back, and that is what is being a good American about. Like, being part of the marketplace of ideas, and but this is very a little bit sophisticated conversation. To teach the elders in the Vietnamese community is to sort of say, we know that you have this great gratitude to be here, but also it's okay to be, we fled communism so that we can have dissent, so that we have dissidents, and that means we are proud patriots, and we're exercising our freedom and liberty. You have to kind of say in that kind of language. And I think especially in the queer community, to really highlight how harmful the Trump administration has been and continues to be against LGBTQ rights. I want to give all my queer and trans Vietnamese friends and family across the internets the permission to go ahead and tell your parents and say, like, make the choice and say, when you vote for Trump, you are voting to hurt me. And the one thing, the message that may break through in all the noise of all this, deification of Trump, which is especially what Balki was mentioning, is to sort of like bring it back to family and bring it back. I mean, the family is so important in Vietnamese culture. And I would say that is the message, that you could try to say, if you're not queer or trans, so whatever issue, he's hurting the environment, he's immigrants, there's so many issues. So that's just make it very personal.
So I mentioned at the top of the show, 14% of Vietnamese American voters are undecided, and over 40% are pretty strong, support for President Trump. Do progressives focus on the 14% undecided, or try to change the hearts and minds of some of the 40%? And also the last question that I had is, what's at stake for you in this election, which I would imagine would be the reason why we all have to be active in talking to folks to go vote anyway, because we do feel like there is something at stake. Dr. Ha.
Well, the ones that are have a strong with Trump, I don't think that a conversation will help. The other thing is that first generation, second generation Vietnamese families don't have conversations in the first place. You'll hear that very commonly. I was fortunate. I talked to my parents growing up, but that was not the norm. And so to be able to convince somebody to change like a hard line, you have to be able to have very in-depth conversations. And that doesn't even happen in the first place. So that's going to be very hard. And so do we go towards the undecided? Absolutely. If there's anything, getting someone to maybe, I've seen it where they won't, okay, fine, I won't vote for Trump. I'm just not going to vote. Well, okay, that's okay. And so I'm able to kind of convince some folks like, well, maybe I would never vote for a Democrat or liberal, but fine, Trump is bad in XYZ. So what are the talking points for that? And what is at stake? Not just for me, but what I see as our country, what's at stake. We have a broken healthcare system. So the Affordable Care Act is at stake. As Balki mentioned earlier, are there ways to improve it? Surely, but we don't see the plan replacement, right? And so we're gonna gut it, and then what's gonna happen, which is interesting because there are many, many Vietnamese Americans that I know in Texas who benefit from the Affordable Care Act. The widening inequality that we are going to see, not even if COVID is managed, we still have issues of an increasing gap between wealth and poor, and so how do we bridge that, right, with policies? Voting rights. I mean, there's so much voter suppression. So Obama said it last night in his speech, you know, we don't vote for this one thing and then think that things going to be perfect the next day. We have to keep voting, and it's not just the presidential election, it's our Senate races, our local representatives, our state representatives, ballot initiatives. And so for the Vietnamese American community, talking about voting, it cannot just be simplified to the presidential election and Trump. It has to continue its force if we want to see the progressive changes that we are asking for in our societies. Yeah, and you know, trying to convince folks that Marxism is not going to happen here, that's an easy. That, you know, like really, that is not going to happen. And last comment is if Trump is, you know, so anti-China and he's anti-communism, I've asked Trump supporters, well, why is he so friendly with Putin?
Juicy?
Yeah. Well, +1 to everything what Dr. Ha said. But on top of that, I think I would actually go for the undecideds and go for them hard because I actually do a lot of phone banking, as I mentioned earlier, and I was very surprised at how many undecided voters there are in Pennsylvania that are Vietnamese. I mean, if you want to make a dent of any kind, if you are, you know, a gung-ho Democrat and you want to go for it, you know, go back to blue, PA, or, you know, Viets for Biden, or just do it. It's every Thursday from, you know, that's today, you know, every Thursday. And so they call you. But in speaking to these Vietnamese Americans, it's a lot of times they're undecided, but then it's really because their parents are so like for Trump. But then I give them permission to vote for Biden, you know, and I say, why don't you just go now? And here's your polling place and get that done. As far as like trying to convince the diehard Trumpers, I think it's, you know, I'm more of a, you know, just keep trying. In the vein of, you know, just tell them your personal story and why it matters to you that you're voting for Democrat. If it's something as simple as education, you know, like maybe tie it to education. What has Betsy DeVos done? You know, and what about all this student loan debt? And what about, you know, just break it down into something very real and tangible and say, this is the reason why I'm voting for Biden. He's gonna have free college and all this. He has all these plans. And I was a Warren Democrat. I am still a Warren Democrat, and I'm all about big structural change. We need this. We need to uplift our middle class again. And the Vietnamese Americans, the majority are middle class. And so those are the issues that matter to most of them. And then also to Dr. Ha's point, realize that voting is a habit and voting is part of being a good American, and voting is like a duty. And like, you fled communism, which is just one party rule. Like, and this is kind of a not really democracy when they say they're, I don't know. Anyways, like, just kind of do that talking point back to them and say, like, you know, if you're such a you know, proponent for freedom and liberty and justice and democracy, you need to vote. That is your responsibility. It's not just a right to vote. People are actively getting their rights taken away to vote, and you have the right to vote and you're wasting it. You're not using your voice. Why don't you use your voice? You know, come back, you know, why? You know, like, what's wrong with you if you're not voting? You know, like, so, you know, just kind of, it's a motivational thing, and it's, you know, it may fall on deaf ears, but for me, what's at stake in this election is just the normalcy of democracy. Democracy can die, and it is dying, you know? And so, like, we need this to happen, and we need to motivate our friends, especially in Pennsylvania, especially in Texas and Georgia, these big swing states. They can definitely make or break the election.
And, you know, frankly, over the years, you had extremely low voter participation amongst the Vietnamese American communities across America. And the biggest the biggest blame resides in the parents who discourage their children from being actively involved, which is exactly what you come over here, you fled tyranny, and yet you're telling people to not get involved. So I think in this case, you've got to make the case to the undecided, but also you've got to make the case to those who actually have never participated, right? Because you have to give them the choice between an educated decision versus an emotional decision. And that's, and I think that's where the young people nowadays are doing such a good job, to me, because they're willing to take the risk and also show the fact that, hey, you know what? My parents came over here, they worked hard and so forth, but I'm making this case, I'm getting more involved because I too want a hand in the betterment of society, right? And that's why I think you've just got to make the case. And it's funny because as a Republican, having been so involved, I can see, I'm trying to debunk some of these narratives that all of you are talking about, because first of all, it's disingenuous, they're outright lies, and it's destructive. And I think the young folks want to have the chance to make decisions based on analyzing both sides and then make it on themselves. So that right there is a winning message. So I'm all for you all being involved in such a in such an engaged manner, and you just have to kind of take that into the states, into the communities where there's still so much Trump support.
We have a question, or someone asked a question on our YouTube chat about why, if people are so supportive of Donald Trump as a bulwark against communism, they ask, why didn't he fight in the Vietnam War against communism when he had a chance? So Juicy, maybe use that in your next phone banking.
I like it. I will.
But another question, I think this is for all of you, and this is the person that writes, I agree with Michelle's comments that the narrative of Vietnamese Americans has been written and exploited by others. Are there good resources we can share with our families about Vietnamese American history and treatment in the United States? Any websites or books or podcasts or anything that you would recommend that they share? Anyone?
We can, there are several current things that are being put together, things that are being currently. I know that Pivot has a database. There's also another group called Vietnamese Solidarity Action Network. And so for your audience, we could share those links and share the documents and some podcasts. I don't have the Rolodex like organized in my head right now, but I know the organizations and the groups that put them up. Reading an alternative version about Vietnamese American life and the Vietnam War requires that we read it from non-Western researchers and authors. And so, that's something that I feel like our community is coming of age. I'll just throw a pitch out there because the question was asked. The film that I worked on called Seadrift, it's a historical look at Vietnamese refugees in Texas in the 1970s, and their confrontation with the KKK and racial tensions in a very small fishing town. And I was only aware of it because I lived there and I grew up there and I'd heard some of the things. But when I went to graduate school, there was nothing, it was not in the books and it wasn't in the history anywhere. And so I'd written about it, and fortunately the director, Tim Tsai, made it into a film, which is fantastic. I recommend the film way more than reading what I wrote. But those kinds of things, I feel like if I had not explored that, that would have been a lost story. So I want to encourage other non-white individuals, folks, minoritized populations to, if we don't see a story that we know, we are the ones that have to write it. And so, Bao article in CNN coming from a Vietnamese American is a powerful message. And so just to say, we can share some of those links for your audience.
And Juicy did share a couple of them. Juicy, why don't you say it, the links you just shared, so that the viewers can hear it.
Sure. So a great project of Pivot, which is a progressive Vietnamese organization, is vietfactcheck.org. So it's just all one word, vietfactcheck.org. It's a great source for dispelling sort of all the stories and the things you hear, especially we talked about on YouTube, where people just kind of like the Alex Joneses of the world, of the Vietnamese world, just speaking in Vietnamese and kind of spewing lies and just misinformation. There's a whole bunch of ways to combat that and talk about, what's the real reality, what's truth. And then you also mentioned the question asked about other resources. I'm a part of Chopsticks Alley here in the Bay Area in San Jose. Chopsticksalleyart.org is a great resource in San Jose area as far as just kind of arts programs and just kind of uplifting Southeast Asian arts and culture. And I actually have a Queer Thoughts on Chopsticks Alley live stream that happens on, I think, the second Thursdays of the month. So, I also have my podcast, Juicy Thoughts, of course, THOTS. Those thoughts are, it's an urban word, you can look it up. But just just about my ideas, I do want to also elevate Dr. Ha's comment about, like, if you are seeing a story, it's all about our stories and sharing our stories, because like there was no Vietnamese American studies growing up when I was in like high school, and actually I feel like I'm still learning. This is part of my political awakening and my identity building, is just kind of what it means to be Vietnamese American in here in 2020. I encourage you to join organizations that uplift identity-based organizations, like if you're a lawyer, Vietnamese lawyer bar association, I'm sure there's others, or make one, because if you don't have one, make it, because there's not many of us, and I'm sure there's other people who would like to be involved just like you.
Great. Michelle?
Elke, did you have anything to add?
Well, you all, and I tell you this is where I'm most impressed, because I do actually rely on Pivot and API Vote, just because I've known obviously some of your members over the years. I think it's been a great resource, especially when it comes to, because why? Because I think the resources are intellectually based and not, just basically a link to some wild, crazy conspiracy theory, right? So at the end of the day, I still think that that's exactly how I would pursue it, and that is to go through these sites as resources. And not only that, but it highlights the fact that, and I always like to reinforce this, because again, to me, having formed a view after reaching out and looking at different resources actually is the only way we can make informed decisions. How do we actually explain that to these folks who already are inclined? That's the difficulty. But so no, I've actually been, and I'm trying to think, there are a number of Vietnamese intellectuals who, in California, who are anti-Trump. And some of my parents' friends, especially in Orange County and so forth, these are the folks who have been part of the last administration of South Vietnam, for instance. Many of them are anti-Trump. So I'm trying to think of how to access their works. If it's in English, then you're going to have a more limited supply, right? Because so much of that is so focused on Vietnam, the Vietnam War. So I just think that, and actually there is over in the West Coast, The Interpreter. I think they've done a good job at also trying to aggregate information, and then also helping to, in a bilingual way, to propagate, and correct certain things. So I've become fans of The Interpreter and what they do, because I think to some degree, it kind of overlaps what Juicy mentioned, which is what Pivot's doing already, So this is such a beautiful homegrown resource that you all are doing. And so every time, I need something, I kind of reach out to a number of you all, whether it's not you directly, but in the past it hasn't been you all directly, but it's great to have. Yeah.
Well, we can also compile everybody's lists, and if you reach out to us at commonwealthclub.org/MMS, John can respond to you. And I think the most important thing out of our talk really is to continue the communication. Definitely get out the vote. Share your personal stories. So all of you out there, do vote, but also support our panelists today. Do read Bauke's opinions piece on CNN. If you just type in Bauke, Baoky, last name Vu, VU, CNN, it'll pop up. Definitely check out the film, Sea Drift Film, by Dr. Tauha, who's involved in it, and take a listen to Juicy Lou on Juicy Thoughts, THOTS. and then last plug, of course, the Commonwealth Club and the programs that we do here are super diverse and a nonpartisan platform to be able to have these discussions. I want to thank our panel. Thank you so much, Bauke, Dr. Tauha, and Juicy for joining us for this very important conversation. Less than 2 weeks away. And then thank you for joining us. And on that final plug, the Commonwealth Club, the platform for these important discussions, tomorrow night, Friday night, we will be live with Joshua Wong, a pro-democracy activist, youth activist from Hong Kong. If some of you are following the news, that movement is now big in Thailand. And so we'll discuss China and we'll discuss democracy with Joshua tomorrow night. So I hope you'll join us. Last words, I'll leave it up to John.
A big thanks to everybody, and have a good and safe rest of your week. And again, always find out more Michelle Meow Show programs at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Go finish the job.
Thank you.